Right. So we can start.
Okay, hi. My name is Emmanuel Akwasi Adu-Ampong. It's a privilege and an honor to be here. I went to Tech, the old university. Just say, don't beat me. But I went to Kenya University, Army Forest University. I know, don't beat me when I leave here. Just say, it's a beautiful university out here and a nice campus. We're one people, it's a joke. I know. So yeah, currently I'm an assistant professor in cultural geography at the University in the Netherlands. I'm actually on field right here doing some research on slavery heritage tourism at Elmina Castle and Port Amsterdam. So it's really serendipity that I can come and present part of my work here. And I've titled this Tracing the Transformative Role of Slavery Heritage Tourism in Unifying the Global African Family, just to see the important role that tourism can play when we're talking about unifying global African family, as someone saying we are one neighbor. So this is me. If there's any tourism student here, please get your library to get a copy of a recent book that we have, Large Network Book of Tourism in Africa, a Sustainable Tourism Policy Planning in Africa. I'm also a coordinator of a journal, Tourism Planning and Development. So again, if you have any manuscript around tourism and planning, please want to submit it into the journal, and we'll be happy to support your publication efforts. Okay, so some headlines. It might be weird to see headlines in which slavery is being erased from plantations, because plantations are de facto places where slavery happened. So how is it possible that you can go on a tour on, say, slavery plantations in American South, and yet still you have slavery being erased? So these are some of the headlines. And one thing that has been shown is that sometimes as slavery is being talked about in these thoughts, people get a bit agitated because tourism has been used and defined in ways in which people see it solely as a leisure, hedonistic activity. But what I'm trying to show is that we can rethink tourism as being transformative, as enabling us to engage with difficult aspects of our past. And that can be through slavery tours in Castle or walking tours in Lisbon in terms of the slavery traces that's available in that city. Okay, so even though I have a very short time, I need to do this. So I'm going to show you a video. Someone already have seen it, but I'd like you to pay particular attention, identify some of the key symbolism. We don't have time, so we can't type it, but I will take like 3 comments from you as to what you feel are the key messages being conveyed, how the global debates are being drawn on in this debate, how simplified it's making it or complicated, and what kind of debates and discourses it's being drawn upon here. So pay attention and make your notes, and we'll take some feedback before I continue. So let's see if it works. It's coming. It's coming. We didn't share sound. No, it didn't share sound.
A small town in the Gold Coast, which is time in 1482, a Portuguese fleet of ships under the command of Don Diego Azambuja landed at Elmina, a small town in the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. Europeans started trading in gold and salt, then timber and rum. Then slowly, with the aid of religious missionaries, gunpowder and fiery cannons, they started stealing people and capturing prisoners of war who were royals as slaves. They would keep them in dungeons and ship them to the Wild West as work animals to be worked to death. Most of your ancestors fought back, both at home and on arrival, until they became independent. But the struggle still continued as they fought for their right to be treated as humans. Meanwhile, we were also fighting for our land, pride, and freedom to be ourselves. And punished for sharing our resources, being forgiving and charitable.
Right. Unite black people. Kwame, sis like a lunch. Rap that. Ghana, Jamaica.
Africans around the world, this time you coming back home. And when you find the roots and culture, remember you're not alone. Come home with me, home with me, home with me. You better come home with me, come home with me, come home with me. Africans around the world, this time you coming back home. And when you find the roots and culture, remember you're not alone. Come home with me, home with me, home with me. You better come home with me, come home with me, come home with me. The gates of no return, we break it down. Until you can return, I'm breaking down. The land of Nubia ready to bend and take a town. The gold is yours for here to shine, I'm taking a crown. And me and Muse and more than 40 acres. I waiting you, we got dough for the bakers. Ain't no use, steady waiting for the paychecks. Looting for looting and shooting you, they call you niggas. The Venus of Africa, big hips. Traditions and culture still rich. But you gotta remember few tricks. Imperialism is not over, it still is. Emmanuel James, Sean Bell, and Amadou Diallo. Eric and Michael Brown, Mama Africa say hello. Died in pain, I reveal the spirit sing along. That is the sounds of Jacob, you never be alone.
Food and money and milk and the honey and the untold glory of his and her story. Every day is sunny and the rivers keep running and the day is coming. Africans will be standing tall.
Africans around the world, this time you coming back home. And when you find the roots and culture, remember you're not alone. Come home with me, home with me, home with me. You better come home with me, come home with me, come home with me.
Back to Africa, back to Africa. Now the world and the man.
Come home with me, come home with me. Antigua, Aguila, Bermuda, Trinidad and Tobago, Aruba, Bahamas.
I mean, we get the gist of it. So I'll pause. Any courageous volunteer want to share what they picked up from the video, what they think of it, if you've seen it before or not? Anyone? What stood out for you? Is it an accurate reflection of history? No volunteer? Okay. Well, I think that there's so many ways you can dissect it. You can consider who they went to give the token to return home to. So again, it's the ordinary people along the street in the US, or are there specific people? What kind of message that entails? If it's still happy? It also raises questions about who is able to afford to come back home. And that's why, in a way, tourism offers us an opportunity to think through how we can unite the global family in a much more open way, and not so much those who are only able to afford it, in a sense. So, just briefly around heritage and dissonance. Slavery heritage is heritage, even though it represents a very sensitive or sad part of our history. But in a way, it is very dissonant because it's how we are managing the past and the contestation over it. How do we remember slavery? Who remembers it? Who tells the story? What kind of story is being told by the tour guides at the Elmina Castle? To who do these stories change depending on the people on the tour? I spent last 2 weeks following a number of tours at the Elmina Castle, and it's quite interesting. And again, too early to make any sort of analysis out of it, but I find it really interesting the consistency in some of the story, the emphasis that is given in part of the story, but also how the tour guides themselves reflect, how they reflexively engage with the narrative that they develop, that they tell to people, the kind of conflict that sometimes they feel about telling the story to different types of people. And we won't stay too much here. So basically, I'm doing this kind of conceptual work where I'm theorizing, kind of starting from this primacy of place and practices and performativity. And by place, I mean, why do we do slavery heritage tourism at Elmina Castle? Why not for Amsterdam? Why not all the other 17 forts along the coast? So what is about this particular place that makes us do slavery tourism there? What does that tell us? What does that hide? And that's why I titled this the Geographies of Embodied Absences, because by identifying these sites, we also make some sites absent. And I want to understand how these interplay between absences and presences opens up spaces to think about what practices goes on in slavery heritage at Elmina Castle. So I'm trying to understand when someone comes, what do? They go to the teller, they pay their receipt. Some say 40 cedi for a foreigner. An African American coming home, why should I pay 40? What sort of practices goes on? You go to the museum, spend 10 minutes. When a tour is ready, you come along, they take you through these itinerary. I want to understand these practices and how these practices over time tells different story, how they give meaning to what happens there. And I'm also interested in what is known as performativity, how tour guides perform their role, because it's not just telling a story, it's a performance. How much that performance gives meaning to people, because you can tell a story very just a monotone telling of a story, but you can also put a performance in it, give meaning, give emotions, and that generates emotions not only in the tour guide, but also in the visitors, and how that emotional work pushes people when they leave that place to engage with this history of slavery, because some people are coming for emotion, but the number of people, say university students at UCC on the weekend want to go for a leisure tour, they are not so much looking for the emotion. I mean, when you follow some tours, they get to a point and they just lose interest in the story. Oh, it's a nice place, selfie time. But for some African American, it's not about that. They don't want to take pictures of themselves at this place. So how do tour guides negotiate these differing motivations and experiences that people are seeking? And that's what I'm trying to find out, how this process works. So to kind of theorize tourism then, not just a hedonic leisure activity where you go and have fun and swim on the beach and lie on the beach and sun bath, but rather to think of tourism as involving sociocultural practices, the practices of what happens when you get to the castle, someone takes you, you go to the museum, a tour guide will take you around, tells you the story, that practices, that performance in which the tour guide puts in his or her own emotions in it to tell you the story, and also the spaces of transformation that then opens up. And I have some set of questions for us to kind of think about in these embodied absences. So when we think of slavery heritage shows in different places, whether it's here, in the US, in Amsterdam, where I'm based now, where there's a Black heritage tours in Amsterdam, there was no slavery there, some will say, but there are traces of slavery, because the money that was generated through Suriname plantations found its way back to Amsterdam, built up buildings. There are monuments and murals on walls that a tour guide has developed an itinerary that takes people around. And I have 2 minutes. So I would say we need to consider what is remembered, what is commemorated, what is memorialized, but which parts of the past do we narrate? Which parts of the past become heritage? So again, we have a number of sites. Why Elmina and Cape Coast? Why not the rest? What is particular about them, apart from them being big? And what sort of practices and performances push this peripheral narrative? Because some narratives are on the side and other narratives are very strong, because in terms of the building, there are a lot of things that happened after slavery. How much is that involved in the narrative now? So we talk about the schools, the police training depot that it was used for, the district assembly that it was used for, and why not? So this is kind of my conceptual building that would say slavery heritage sites become transformed into slavery heritage tourism places. They are sites first, when they become tourism places because of these practices, these performances, and these interpretations that we put on them. And these interpretations are mutually co-constituted. So it's not just a tour guide coming with an interpretation, but also the visitor comes with a question and their own interpretation. And in that interaction, we construct what becomes of Elmina Castle as a tourism place. And in that, you have this embodied absence, because people go with their body, they hear some stories, they don't hear some other stories, and that sometimes they embody that story. So local Elmina people, they embody a particular story about this side. And through that, we kind of change the narrative. And I'll go back to my conclusion. Just 30 seconds. So I'm doing this 3-year project, looking at slavery, heritage, and tourism in Ghana, Suriname, and the Netherlands. My basic question is, how do tourism practices and performativity in these places make visible the embodied absence of the past? What story is being told in these places? In Ghana, in Suriname, where Dutch took enslaved people from Ghana to work on plantations, and the profit flowed back into the Netherlands. So for the next 3 years, I hope I get the opportunity to come back after my Elmina fieldwork, come and tell you more about what I found around these places, also Port Amsterdam. So finally, I use the idea or the concept of embodied absence to refer to the physical presence but narrative absence of the shared history and role of people of African descent in European societies. Because across Europe, you have that. You have the physical presence, but the narrative is quite absent. And finally, when we focus on practice and performances, it shows us how we stimulate public memories and engagements about this aspect of our past and identity and who belongs in which society and how. Thank you.
Thank you very much.